Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is entitled The EU's Term 2024 to 2029. We're looking at the priorities for sports and active brands, and of course, with that, the industry in general. Now, before we get started, I'll just make a couple of introductions. My name is Nick Morgan, and we are part of Nutrition Integrated, who's pretty chuffed and pretty proud to be supporting this webinar. We're a data and insights company, but for the purposes of today, you don't need to know too much about that. My job is to simply host this webinar and to engage in what will hopefully be useful, intelligent and clear Q&A with my partner in crime, Claudia. So Claudia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Nick. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. So my name is Claudia Mucciardi. I am one of the vice chairs of ESSNA. I also head up regulatory and quality compliance for Nutrabolt in EMEA. I've been working in the field of compliance in sports foods and supplements for close to 15 years now, in a variety of different companies and capacities. So hopefully I can, inform you on some interesting topics today regarding the new policy 2024-2029 within Europe.
Brilliant. Thanks, Claudia. Now, we have prepared a short presentation just to provide some context. But before we play that, just let me give you the rules of the game today. You will listen to the short overview, which I think provides a great overview of a couple of the key areas that are really important for you to think about over the next couple of years. We will then have a Q&A to which we've gone through a lot of detail that we think is really important to talk about. So we will refer to lots of things. So basically have pens and paper ready. At any stage, you can ask questions, and we do want you to ask questions. If they are topical as we engage in the Q&A, I will try to ask them as we go along. Otherwise, we will have a scheduled piece at the end where you can ask away all the questions that you have. So there are no silly ones. Please get them down in the system and we will try to ask them as best as we can. So that's the rules. Otherwise, sit back for now. Hopefully this will be of use and we'll get started with the opening presentation.
So today I'll be speaking about the EU policy and regulatory landscape and how that affects sports and active nutrition. So first, a few slides about ESSNA. So ESSNA is the European Specialist Sports Nutrition Alliance. It is a pan-European trade association that represents the interests and acts of the voice of the sports and active nutrition sector in Europe. It was created in 2003, and this was to prevent the introduction of a piece of EU legislation, which would have been very detrimental to the industry. Today, it's grown to be a very well-established and respected organization that represents businesses across the entire supply chain, and this is in engaging with policymakers, stakeholders, and the media. So looking at ESSNA's objectives, we have removing regulatory barriers and promoting a positive policy environment for sports foods by highlighting the specificities of the sports nutrition sector. We have educating policymakers and regulators on these specificities, as well as on the purpose of sports foods to achieve positive legislative change. We have mitigating challenges and identifying any opportunities that are related to EU-UK regulatory divergence. Positioning ESSNA and its members as responsible players in the industry and as partners of policymakers in a transition to sustainable food systems. And finally, we have tackling inadvertent doping and non-compliance, and this is to improve consumer safety and to reduce unfair competition. So here we have a snapshot of ESSNA's members, and you'll see these range from sports nutrition brands, manufacturers, ingredient suppliers, and more specialized companies. And it's worth noting that even though ESSNA is a European trade association, its reach is global. So now we'll move on to the main portion of the presentation. So if we look at the regulatory framework of sports foods, it's worth noting that sports foods are strictly regulated in Europe. So for one, they fall under general food law, and this covers general safety and labeling requirements, nutrition and health claims, as well as regulations on certain substances that can be added to foods. So that includes, for example, additives or approved sources of vitamins and minerals. As a separate branch, still under general food law, we do have the Food Supplements Directive, and this calls out specific compositional and labeling requirements for those products that are classed as food supplements. So this will be relevant, obviously, to some sports foods that meet the definition of food supplements. So for anyone who's unaware, Food supplements are defined in this directive as foodstuffs that are meant to supplement the normal diet, that are concentrated sources of nutrients or other substances with nutritional or physiological effect, and are marketed in dose form to be taken in small quantities. Finally, sports foods will be governed, using the Novel Foods Regulation, which deals with any new ingredients. So let's look at the last 5 years at any kind of policy initiatives and how those could affect sports nutrition sector. So we'll start off with mandatory front of pack nutrition labeling and nutrient profiles. So back in 2020, the European Commission launched its farm to fork strategy. And this has really been the flagship initiative in terms of promoting healthier and more sustainable food systems. So like some of their objectives were to promote healthier diets and to improve information to consumers on foods. So to do this, they want to introduce harmonized mandatory front of pack nutrition labeling as well as nutrient profiles. So the European Parliament did vote in favor of these. However, they did call out that any measures taken need to be backed by sound science, need to consider consumer understanding, and take into account any additional burden to food operators. So what are the latest developments? Well, the European Commission is still working on these. However, it looks like there may be the potential option to have a non-legislative, more comprehensive or balanced approach, which would basically support national initiatives around food information and then the reformulation and marketing of unhealthy foods. So second, we have nutrition and health claims regulation. As mentioned previously, the European Parliament's report does show support for nutrient profiles to prohibit the use of nutrition and health claims on foods that are high in fat, sugars, or salts. However, it's worth noting that the report also calls out that particular attention should be given to special purpose foods. In terms of latest developments, we have the European Parliament issued its resolution on nutrition and health claims. So it's reiterated its request on nutrient profiles and setting of nutrient thresholds, which will determine whether or not claims can be made. I'm calling on the Commission to address the on-hold list of botanical claims. Again, very relevant to our industry, as sports foods may include botanicals. And finally, suggesting the restriction of the use of the no added sugar claims. So this is also relevant to our industry, however, in a negative way. Finally, we have MPLs. So as mentioned earlier in the presentation, we have the Food Supplement Directive, which actually dates back to 2002. In this directive, it does state that maximum permitted levels of vitamins and minerals shall be set. In the meantime, because of delays, individual European countries have set their own maximum limits, and this has caused some fragmentation within Europe. However, in 2020, almost 2 decades later, the European Commission finally did pick up on this work. So they created a task force made up of member states, and they mandated EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, to review safe upper limits of vitamins and minerals. So EFSA's work has now completed. There have been public consultations, and now the task force over the past few years has actually been meeting to determine what is the best kind of calculation model or method to translate these upper limits that EFSA has set into MPLs. At this point, we actually have very little visibility of what this could actually look like. However, the European Parliament has put forth a parliamentary question to the European Commission, so hopefully we'll be able to get some more information on the progress in the near future. So following the European elections, we now have a new European Parliament. We have a new European Commission that is meant to be fully operational by the end of the year. So looking at the policy developments over the last 5 years, what can we now expect from this new policy cycle? And what are the priorities of the industry for the next 5 years in the EU?
Brilliant. That was a presentation. Thanks very much for that, Claudia. It provides great context to everyone listening. Now, we are going to talk as a Q&A, open, live, about each of those areas in sequential order, basically as they are presented. So we'll go through those, and I promise you there's a lot of detail that is actually really worth discussing. Just before we do that, Claudia. There's clearly a lot going on, but probably the most important thing that sits within the whole of that presentation is there is now a new commission starting sort of 24 to 29 that will be up and running technically in the next few weeks. You know, what's the vibe effectively? What is the vibe of that commission? What do we feel that commission is about to do? Do we feel any fresh impetus, any fresh intensity, any fresh scope to do something with more vigor? What is it that we feel at the moment about the commission for the next few years?
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, so we don't have absolute clarity yet because the European Commission hasn't yet published their work program for 2024-2029. But Ursula von der Leyen, who's been reelected as the Commission's president, she has announced the political guidelines, which is kind of gives a bit of a sneak peek into what we could potentially expect. So in the first 100 days of the mandate, we can expect a new vision for agriculture and food. And this is expected to replace the farm to fork strategy, which, as mentioned in the presentation, was like the flagship initiative for the last 5 years. There's also been a recently published report on strategic dialogue of food and agriculture, and that kind of gives some recommendations and points to some areas of potential focus. So we have increased interest in plant-based proteins. We have reviewing of labeling rules to incorporate digital tools for communicating voluntary information. And there's also evaluating of current national measures related to marketing or restricting the marketing of HFSS foods to children. From the side of sustainability, just a small point on this is that it does look like the focus will be on implementing rules that were laid out in the European Green Deal as opposed to creating any new legislation. So that's, I guess, a positive note that should alleviate some administrative burden for businesses. But yeah, looking at more like, the labeling, front of pack nutrition labeling, nutrient profiles, those kind of initiatives, there's been really quite a few delays. And this probably stems from the fact that there's a lot of kind of conflicting ideas from the different member states of what actually constitutes a healthy diet. And if we take into account these delays and we pair them up with the fact that the Commission is looking at focusing a bit more on agriculture now, it does raise the question if the public health aspect of food policy is now being deprioritized, which is clearly quite important and substantial for sports nutrition. Now, this is obviously just kind of food for thought. We have no idea if this is actually the case. It just is interesting with the fact that in the political guidelines that Ursula von der Leyen announced, there was no mention of the role of nutrition in public health. So, I mean, this could have been a kind of strategic decision not to include this, just because if we look at the last 5 years, how there was a lot of focus in this area, and yet there were, really a lot of complications and delays in implementing any of the initiatives, for example, front of pack nutrition labeling. This could be why they've kind of been left out at this point.
So if I understand that right, and hopefully I do, that if the public health aspect of food policy is being deprioritized, that's a sentiment that we think might be there. That's quite a big deal because it could lead to a lot of changes or discussions or things that get right to the core of what causes the sports and active industry a few problems. Is that correct?
Yes. So typically the challenges that we see are related to the fact that the sports and active nutrition sector doesn't really fit in some of the models, basically, that are related to public health and in the food policy. So if that would be deprioritized, we'd actually see some alleviation in terms of we wouldn't really be presented with as many of the challenges that we could potentially be seeing now.
So effectively, we can take a crumb of enthusiasm, but as it stands, that's our interpretation of where they sit at the moment based on what is happening. So at this step, any further discussion is broadly conjecture, let's just call it that. But there's maybe something there that gives some positivity to everyone listening, that there might be some movement potentially right at the heart of what causes us as an industry problem. Fine.
At this point, we can't jump to conclusions. We don't know if that is the case, but if that were to be the case, that it were to be deprioritized, then that would be beneficial for sports nutrition for sure.
Cool. Just two other questions very quickly on this before we go into the areas. You mentioned about evaluating national measures around marketing of HFSS foods to children. Now, I think this is a definition thing, but I view HFSS as a UK-centric piece of legislation. For example, just what do you mean about that in the context of the EU and the UK, just for
Yeah,
everyone?
sorry. So just to clarify, HFSS is not being referred to as almost the UK's definition. It's more just to embrace all foods that are unhealthy, so high in fat, sugars, and salts, basically, and just to make sure that there are measures in place to make sure these are not being marketed, to children.
Brilliant. And the final question, which I think I'll already know the answer to, but you mentioned that they hadn't published their work profile yet. Do we have any indication, or do they set deadlines to when they might set their work profile?
Not that I'm aware, but I would expect it would be coming out relatively soon, because I would expect it would be coming out towards the beginning of the 5 years to show what is in plans.
Yeah. But of all things they do, I would hope that they publish a work profile that is relatively transparent for everyone in terms of where they're going. So let's look out for that. Okay, great. Okay, topic number one that you spent a little bit of time on was front of pack nutrition labeling and also the nutrient profiles. For the context of dummies like myself, or the lowest common denominators of knowledge, can you just give me a bit of a definition of front of pack nutritional labeling and then nutritional profiles, or nutrient profiles, let's call them? Same thing, different. Just give us context to what that really means just before we get stuck into more questions.
Sure. So front of pack nutrition labeling is basically a repeat of some key nutritional information on the front of pack, because just to make sure, in case consumers are wanting to buy products and they're not actually reading back of pack to look at the ingredients or the nutrition information, this is going to be very clearly showing them straight away when they pick up the products how much, for example, energy, how much fat, how much saturates, how much sugars, how much salt, as an example. So this is a way to kind of encourage consumers to pick up healthier products versus unhealthy, because if they see, higher values for the negative ingredients or negative nutrients, or see if it's color coded, which is an option as well, hopefully the intention was that they would be less likely to consume those foods. So they were looking at different types of models. There probably our audience is aware, like Nutri-Score was one of the big ones. There was the front of pack, almost like kind of traffic light labels that the UK is currently using. There was like a nutrient-informed battery that Italy was using. So these are all different models that they were looking at in terms of to come up with a harmonized one that could be used European-wide. So that's front of pack nutrition labeling.
Yeah, so basically that's the idea, and the nutrient profiles is an execution of that as a potential tactic, correct?
Essentially, yeah. So nutrient profiles is basically if you have products that are high in these negative nutrients, basically, then you don't want to be having health claims or nutrition claims on them that are then going to encourage the consumer to buy them. So the idea was any food product that's considered unhealthy because it's got these high levels of these kind of negative nutrients would not be permitted to make nutrition and health claims.
Cool. And just why are we worried about this? Why do we care? Just put this into context. What problems does this cause?
Yes. So so the way that we expected the commission was probably going to roll this out when this was being discussed was almost like a blanket rule, blanket application. So it basically means that every kind of area of the foods, all food sectors would be covered basically in the same way. And if we look at sports nutrition, their sports nutrition products would be kind of unfairly penalized because there are certain products that are specifically formulated with higher levels of sugars or higher levels of salts, and therefore would be scoring negatively on these schemes, right? But it is worth noting that these ingredients are in there for a very specific purpose for the end consumer, very functional purpose, and that sports nutrition products are not marketed to the general population. They're basically, specifically marketed towards people who are engaging in high levels of physical activity. So it just goes to show that we just need to keep stressing the fact that any kind of legislation put forward does need to keep in mind like the specificities of the sector and the nutritional needs of active consumers.
Yeah, makes complete sense. So just for the sake of clarity, in Europe, in the EU, sorry, we would love to apply front of pack nutritional labeling for the purpose of consistency and education of consumers, and therefore all of these potential schemes. but it's not in place at the moment, correct?
It's not in place correctly. So some countries do use it, but it's more country-specific, voluntary basis. There is no mandatory front of pack nutrition labeling happening right now, and it's been very difficult to come to a conclusion or to basically be able to implement this, just because there has been so much kind of conflicting ideas of what's the best approach. And yeah, so it's been delayed.
Okay. So in the EU, it's continue as you are. Try to be as credible as we can be as brands and anybody involved in the execution of communication to consumers. Right. So continue as are.
Yes.
In terms of the risk of something coming in, are we saying that they don't even still have consensus of the best approach? So let's assume timelines, which are never quick in my experience in this area. It might still be relatively reasonable length of time because they don't have consensus yet, even on the best execution of this, correct?
Correct. Yes, we haven't really seen, we know that there's been discussions on this. We know that they've been kind of considering different approaches, but there's been no real development in terms of what the next step is, how soon we can see any kind of proper developments.
Okay, so in the EU, it's still an important topic. It hasn't really quite moved forward. They're still discussing it. Continue as is.
Correct.
Good summary.
Yep.
In the UK, though, we have executed it, correct? HFSS.
HFSS, yes. No, front of pack nutrition labeling, again, that's a voluntary scheme like the traffic light system I was mentioning before. HFSS, but that's related to advertising of these products, after a certain time, where they're placed in store at like shelf end or whatever else. So that is applicable in the UK.
And actually, we didn't talk about this in our pre-bit, but any sort of feedback? Is it just that's it? Is there any engagements of how everyone feels about it, whether it's been restrictive, positive? What is the view of it actually in general? Sorry, I haven't.
No, yeah, exactly. I'm like putting me on the spot. Yeah, I actually haven't heard much, to be fair, within my kind of professional capacity. As far as I'm aware, it's kind of just people have kind of gone on with it, but I haven't heard positive or negative.
No, and apologies to Claudia because she wasn't prepared for that question, but it just came into my head, and I just wondered.
No, but it's a good point because I know dealing with retailers, they do often ask, in terms of in my professional role, in terms of our products HFSS compliance. So I know that is something that is being looked at, but whether or not the brands, they're feeling positive or negative about this, I can't say.
Yeah, okay. And maybe another question you can't say on, but is the EU watching on the HFSS to see if it's been successful? And do you think that could have any implications on the timelines in Europe? Again, might be a tough one to answer.
Possibly. I don't know, actually. But I mean, you would expect that there would be a bit of kind of watching each other, essentially UK and EU following each other's progression in terms of legislation and stuff.
Okay. I'll let everyone else decide on the call as to their impressions or view on HFSS, but that's possibly not the purposes of today to discuss whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. Let's just segue actually into MPL's maximum permitted limits. Let me again try to summarize. They want to do maximum permitted limits. Levels, sorry. They've got EFSA to do their thing on upper safe levels, maybe just make sure I'm describing this correctly, but as it stands, we haven't got to MPLs yet.
Exactly. Yeah. So as I mentioned in the presentation, this is something that we have that's mentioned in the 2002 Food Supplements Directive. So finally now the European Commission a few years ago, the European Commission decided to kind of pick up on this work. EFSA has finished their work. So they have reviewed upper safe limits of vitamins and minerals. And we're at the point now that we don't know how these are going to get translated into actually MPLs. So worth noting that MPLs, there are meant to be two sets. So MPLs for foods and MPLs for food supplements, right? It's important, as I mentioned before, about making sure the specificities of the sector are kind of taken into account. Regarding MPLs, it's important to note that, we say people who are very active, they may have greater nutritional needs, right? So if the decision makers aren't aware of this, we do risk having the MPLs that are set a bit too low. And we can use vitamin B6 as an example, because actually when EFSA reviewed vitamin B6, they actually decided to have an upper limit that was half of what it previously was set at. So before, vitamin B6 had an upper limit of 25 milligrams per day. It's now been reduced to 12.5, right? Again, we don't know how this is going to translate, how this upper limit will translate into maximum permitted levels, but it could be that the MPL is set very conservatively, which is obviously going to affect how much brands can fortify their foods or their food supplements, and therefore it could have a knock-on effect to the consumer in terms of being able to get the right levels of nutrition that they may need.
Yeah, you mentioned a few there. So we've got the safe levels known. So EFSA have finished their piece of work.
Yep.
They've recommended that, so we know what they are, correct?
Yes.
And is there any, other than the ones you've mentioned, maybe it is just solely those, is there any indications from the upper safe levels that we think the MPLs we should be really concerned about? Anything?
I think the main one is vitamin B6 because it has gone down by half. I think all the other ones are more or less consistent with what they previously were. I think even a couple of them have even gone up to what they previously were. So they've actually raised the upper limits, but vitamin B6 is the one that has been halved. And knowing how there are many sports supplements that are fortified with vitamin B6, then yeah, there could be implication there. But again, we don't know what it will mean in terms of MPL. We just know that the upper limit has been halved.
So step one is they've got to decide the translation from the safe limits into MPLs, and then they need to put that into action in terms of then setting MPLs, which would be, in theory, a harmonized set of MPLs across all EU-related countries.
Yes, exactly. Because right now we actually have deharmonization or fragmentation because certain countries have created their own limits. And then when you're trying to sell a product across the region, you end up just having to go with the lowest common denominator to make sure that it's going to be compliant in all countries. So this would actually force a standard level across the EU.
Which is probably a good thing, right? I would assume.
Could be, yeah. As long as levels aren't set too low.
Yeah, correct. But then at the same time, let me just put this also into context of sports nutrition, because it's vitamins and minerals, right? So it's literally the alphabet.
Yeah.
It just doesn't apply. So if I'm thinking about pre-workouts, and I'm thinking about a lot of products within our industry that are based on, as I would describe, actives. So let's say citrulline in a pre-workout, choline in a pre-workout, and a brain-related product, whatever it may be. I think everyone knows their examples. This has nothing to do with that. This is just vitamins and minerals. So just
exactly
context, the benefits or the main ingredients that we might promote in those other products, levels related to that, that's down to the discretion of the brand still.
Exactly, or to national rules, because those are not harmonized either across the EU. So that's down to any national laws or what the brand decides to do if there are no nationally set maximum limits.
And is it still the same old watch outs? Like caffeine still a problem across harmonization across harmonized countries? Is that maybe the one that still causes a few issues?
Yeah, and I don't think there's any kind of plan to harmonize level of caffeine, but we do have EFSA's kind of safety report that they put out, that still says 200 milligrams of caffeine max per serving, 400 milligrams per day. And you do have some European countries that have kind of translated that into their national rules. So those are the maximums that they'll set. But you have others that have actually ignored that and have gone higher. Others have not set any maximum limits from a national level, and others that have actually set their limits for caffeine much lower. So again, you get fragmentation on caffeine as well.
Great, brilliant. If they do set MPLs, let's assume they follow through. Let's assume that we get there with this new commission. When the UK left Europe, we adopted everything into our UK law. What happens to any new laws set at an EU level with regards to its integration into UK law? Effectively, is the UK looking at what will happen and then we'll translate across, or we just we adopted everything, but we then go status quo and our heads are turned and we're not worried about now what's happening in the EU? What's the relationship there?
Yeah.
We have to
I would expect the UK, the UK has the opportunity, which we can talk about a bit later, to amend, any legislation in place now. And it really isn't doing so too much, because I presume that they have enough other things to worry about rather than food law. So anything that Europe is doing, I'm sure the UK is watching, but I don't think they're necessarily going to create legislation to follow suit. I think what will come down to is brands who want to sell across the EU and the UK will end up applying the same rules that are set for the EU to the products that they're selling in the UK, simply to keep consistent, the same product and not have to have a separate formulation or a separate label or anything like that. But in terms of actually UK following suit with any new legislation, I don't think that is kind of their top priority.
Cool. And I mean, again, I asked this knowing the answer. Any timeline associated, maybe at all, to this MPL transition? Anything?
No, not that I have to share today.
As always, people, it's a holding pattern. Just as you fly into Heathrow, we will circle for as long as they want us to circle for. But needless to say, we always need to know, of course, that where we are in the current time. Let's move on. Nutrition and health claims regulation. I think the first thing I just wanted to say, I think the first point you made was this concept that if a product didn't meet front of pack nutritional labeling / nutrient profiles or scores, for example, then there is a sentiment that they would prefer or would like to restrict people making nutritional health claims on those products. Is that correct? Is that the first point we wanted to make?
Yeah, so that's linking the nutrition and health claims to nutrient profiles and restricting them basically on foods that are considered unhealthy.
Yeah, except that they're not currently adopted in Europe.
No.
And therefore that's
status quo for now. Yeah.
Status quo. If they do we know what the threshold of application would be? So if someone, because nutrient profiles, of course, are for an education purposes, but yes, right or wrong, healthy, unhealthy. Any indication of what thresholds would be?
No, and actually, I believe in the presentation, I think the Parliament has called for those thresholds to be kind of defined, so that it's very clear where we draw the line of where claims can and cannot be made, because we don't know if it's like, does it have to be more than one of the negative nutrients, or does it have to be a certain level? So yeah, we're unaware of that at this point.
And forgive my naivety, but then in the UK with the application of HFSS, which of course is more about advertising to children, there's a slightly different element to that. Are you restricted in nutritional health claims on products that are deemed not appropriate HFSS wise to be to children close to front of store? No.
No, I think that's pretty much different as far as I'm aware.
Good to know. So what else do we need to know about nutritional health claims? What else did they say in terms of the commission?
So yeah, there is this Parliament report actually, which is interesting because it actually calls for the approved list of nutrition health claims to be regularly updated in terms of like any development, scientific developments or advancements in food and nutrition. So I think this is actually really positive. But we also do know that, nutrition health claims regulation isn't really fit for purpose as it currently stands. Yep. I'd say in one way you can say, okay, it's very transparent. The consumer has a lot of trust and confidence in terms of what's being communicated on pack is scientifically backed. They're not being misled. But on the other side, it is very restrictive. So especially when it comes to sports foods, it really does kind of limit and pose challenges in terms of how brands can effectively communicate the benefits of their products. And I mean, we see this with a couple of nutrition and health claims, where they've basically been positively assessed by EFSA, but have been rejected. So there was glucose, there was sodium. Both of these are very important, nutrients for people who are engaging in a lot of sports, but you can't communicate anything about them.
Yeah, I think I would wholeheartedly agree. This is definitely positive, right? This is good. This is good. It shows that they're trying to modernize the process and play true to what good science should be, which should be current and show evolution. Do we have any idea on the process? Like, how would that actually happen? Would they prioritize certain claims for review? How do they prioritize new ones? Is that still following a separate approach for approval type thing? Like, what do we know about process or anything?
Not much. To be fair, I'll be very honest with you.
No.
Yeah, we don't know, to be fair. But we know this is being looked at. It's been highlighted, so that's actually that's a positive that we'll take with us.
And for everyone listening, sorry, there's always an element there of I guess maybe I say we know the answers and there's nothing, we're just trying to get to the point. Do we know, what do we not know? And we might joke about these things, but obviously it's important to know the status of all of this stuff. I guess the other thing I wanted to talk to you about was, how will they, keep it up to date? Again, remember, this is just a comment or a question for you, but science has evolved so quickly over the last 2 or 3 years. So, claims that exist, new claims, evolution of how they're even taken to science that's been completed over the last 12 months, 18 months, new consensus statements. I guess we're just hoping that good principles will be applied to this process.
That's the thing. Yeah, we want everything to be based on kind of independent, sound science. I mean, that's a good point, because even in terms of the on-hold claims, the on-hold botanical claims, it's like, these have been on hold for, I can't even remember how many years. Now, if we were to now re-look at them as they currently stand, there's a whole advancement that could have happened in terms of, new information, new science that could have come about in the last however many number of years. That's a very good question in terms of how that's going to be addressed. And actually, we don't know at this point. But well, I think the commission has the mandate to pick that up, because it's been those on-hold claims have been on hold for too long.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think just in general, it sounds like actually, obviously we're here on behalf of ESSNA and the White House communications. That just feels like a really big area for us to be right on the front foot for. How could they do it? What would be a good approach to do it? How can we make sure the needs of specialist populations like ourselves, sports people, could be integrated into that? Because there's so much there that could be addressed that would be, I think, overarchingly correct, but also just, good for the industry. So yeah, watch this space, everybody. You mentioned the on hold claims. Let's just jump to that one. I think I've changed slide schedule, but let's just jump to the on hold claims. They've been on hold for a very long time, so long that we can't remember how long they've been on hold. What did they say? They said, get on with it. Is that effectively the message?
Basically, it was like, yeah, they're on hold. They need to be reviewed and picked up. So let's not have these on hold too much longer. Let's just get on in picking up this piece of work. So whether that's going to be, when that's going to happen, what the timeline's going to be like, again, we don't really have much detail on that.
Yeah, okay. It's a crumb of comfort though. They want to do it, Claudia. They want to do it. It's good. Okay. Are there any other challenges in the sports food sector when it comes to EU legislation on nutrition and public health that we should be interested in?
So I think, I mean, novel foods is always one that we kind of discuss as being a bit problematic, So the novel foods, the current regulation sets up very kind of rigorous standards to ensure consumer health for any new ingredients. But as it currently stands, it's quite a lengthy process, could be quite complex. It causes delays. And I mean, not only for businesses, for companies who are trying to, get their ingredient approved, or brands who want to use that ingredient in their products, but also in the end, the consumer could potentially be missing out on an ingredient that could really, help benefit their sport and their performance, right? So I think we really need to kind of push for a more efficient way to assess novel foods. I mean, still keeping consumer safety at the core, but just making it more efficient so that it keeps Europe kind of competitive in this space as well.
Again, sorry, forgive my naivety. Is novel foods then just unique to the EU? How do we apply that in the UK? Sorry.
So yeah, so the novel foods did kind of translate or transpose, right, with Brexit. But the UK is looking at having its let's say its own way to assess novel food approvals. Yeah.
It's all well and good adopting something, but if there's a process for how that happens, I mean, where does it happen? Does it happen in the UK and in the Europe? Or
yeah, sorry? No, so that's the thing. So in the EU, if you want to get something that's approved with the EU, it's done that way, but you can actually go through the UK. And I think there was the example of monk fruit that was done quite recently. So it was actually the application for using monk fruit as a sweetener was actually done through the UK, and then it was approved that way. But they managed to show that it had significant use prior to kind of the cutoff date of 1997. And then in that way, I believe it was Ireland was maybe the first one to kind of adopt it, and then it kind of was adopted into the EU that way.
Yeah, which is a good example actually for everyone listening. Just for the purposes of monk fruit's really interesting. That typically had been seen as novel, couldn't be used, but certainly for the work that we've done, been highly used as a sweetener within the US based, certainly in bars and a few other areas. Just for the purposes of being seen as being more natural. So quite a natural one, or quite a good one, sorry. But actually what they did was sort of circumvent it by proving it was available pre-1997 or whatever it is, correct? As opposed to following. All right, so the moral of the story there is that ultimately there is a UK route for that. We did adopt it, but yes, the novel foods process is sort of they want it to be streamlined. Makes sense. Anything we also need to talk about? What about UPF's ultra processed foods?
So that's a very hot topic, trendy topic. Don't know how far this is going to go, but it's obviously on a lot of people's minds. So first thing to mention is there's actually no official or legal definition of ultra processed foods, right? So right now we're looking at just kind of a general understanding, which is that highly processed foods are foods that have been highly processed, and those are unhealthy, which we know is not necessarily the case. I mean, not only for sports foods, but for other foods as well. So I think it's just really important to make sure that that distinction, that like processed food doesn't necessarily equal unhealthy, make sure that's very clearly understood. So if there is at any point some sort of like legislation that comes into play to tackle the consumption of ultra processed foods, that we're not then negatively impacting any products that are like the healthy processed foods, basically. But I mean, I think at this point, it's still kind of too early to understand how this is going to develop, if it does develop in any legislative kind of way.
So what stops anything being in a package in ultra processed food?
That's the thing. Like how much processing is considered ultra processed? Does it impact in terms of number of additives or types of additives or additives at all? Does that impact? I mean, there has been talk about whether any kind of traditional processing, so, boiling, roasting, drying, kind of those kind of things are considered traditional. So that's not ultra processing as soon as you add a little bit more. But then looking at, for example, whey proteins, those are considered ultra processed because the amount of concentration and drying, it goes beyond what you would actually do in your traditional kitchen. So just a standard whey protein, even without flavors or anything, just a standard neutral, unflavored whey protein concentrate is considered ultra processed.
Yeah. And just, is there any way of determining it? So if I think you know what we do. I mean, we take all the ingredients off the back of pack and we can chop them up and tell anybody anything they want to know about them. Is there any way of saying from the back of pack if something's processed or not?
Well, because at this point we don't have a definition even, so we don't know, right? So that's like I mentioned, like, does it have to do with the additives that are being used or anything? But then again, you think additives are there for a purpose, right? They're there to extend shelf life or to, whatever the case may be. And so you kind of think, well, if you're not going to have the additives, is everything that's going to be non-ultra processed, is that something that you have to eat kind of within 2 days? Because otherwise, you're going to throw out. Then you're looking at a whole other bit about like the whole food waste. It's a whole other section we need to kind of consider. So
So if you had to summarize UPFs in terms of what everyone needs to know who's watching now or watching on demand, what in 20 seconds, what is it they fundamentally need to, is this just a media thing?
yeah, I would say like watch the space. We don't know how this is going to develop, but just know ultra processed foods is not that all processed foods are unhealthy. I think that's kind of the main messaging.
Okay.
And that in
Cool.
terms of sports nutrition, yes, depending on how this progresses, we could be affected. But I think that's the main messaging, is to make sure that everybody understands that highly processed foods do not equal unhealthy foods.
For everyone listening, there's a couple more topics that we just want to go into for the last few minutes. Do please ask any questions if you have any. I can't believe that we're asking or answering everything that must be in your head, so please do ask something. But for the purposes now, I'll just keep going. There's a couple more areas just to touch on. Claudia, there's so much we've discussed. We joke about the status quo, but we see that there's sentiment to do some stuff. There's some bit of renewed, interest going on at a commission level. Brilliant. What is ESSNA doing to keep forcing this approach? What's the typical? This is not the typical answer. Just what is ESSNA actually doing? What are we doing here? Come on.
So ESSNA has recently launched its manifesto, so that covers all of these points we've been discussing, and talks about the issues and what can be done to address these challenges. And I mean, one of their objectives is to kind of keep engaging with policymakers. And I think that's what they just need to keep doing, is to, engage with the policymakers, build those relations with the European Commission and the Parliament, and just make sure that the specificities of our sector and the priorities of our sector keep being communicated, so that this is really always kind of front of mind when any kind of legislation is being considered and discussed.
Okay, brilliant. Good. So everyone keep joining the fight. I think that's really important. So we move forward. If we don't do it, nothing will ever happen, or we won't have a view in it or a voice in it, I guess is the point. Two last things. There is a few other things. Just can we talk about mutual recognition? Something that should make our lives easier, but at times makes our lives
Doesn't
much
always,
harder.
yeah. So
So
mutual
just
recognition never really works as well as we want it to, unfortunately. So yeah, for anyone who's unaware, mutual recognition is really the regulatory framework to ensure the free movement of goods within the single market within the EU. But really, whether this is down to member states kind of having different interpretations of the EU law or having their own national legislation in place, or just like a poorly applied, poor application of the mutual recognition principle, we do see barriers to trade. So I think two things. I think number one, the mutual recognition regulation has to be enforced, in alignment with any national laws, which probably it's not happening at this point. But also we do know the European Commission is actually reviewing this regulation, and they have consulted with ESSNA. And I know quite a few years back, they did actually, there was like a new regulation on mutual recognition, which came out, which was published. So we were still, I'm not sure if things have actually improved since then, but just to say it's still not at the ideal place where it needs to be. So this is still being reviewed at the EU Commission level.
Okay, great. Probably don't have any additional questions on that one, actually. In the interest of time, let's just we've asked about the UK a couple of times, and apologies for everyone listening. This isn't about a UK-centric webinar, just the obvious elephant in the room that we left Europe, and there's a lot of people who try to do business in the UK and in Europe. So what's the situation in trading in the UK above and beyond what we've discussed already?
Yeah, so like even just talking about mutual recognition before, which is EU specific. So the UK is not included in that, but obviously we want to kind of keep consistency where possible, right? So I think with the UK leaving the EU, the UK does have now, even though we've transposed all of the legislation, the UK does have the opportunity now to adjust, amend, update legislation as it sees fit. So I mean, it could potentially take some of pieces of legislation that are a bit more problematic and troublesome to deal with, and update them and streamline them. And that could potentially boost innovation, but then you also have to weigh that up against the regulatory divergence with the rest of the EU.
Okay.
So I mean, look, we have one possibility is that the UK does actually make some amends and streamline. And I mean, important to know, does this successfully, right? And then if it does this successfully, that could then be almost an example to the EU to see how this can be done in a more streamlined way. And then would the EU then follow suit to be, more competitive in that space, and also just to keep more consistencies and just be kind of easier for kind of trade within the region as well. So whether that's going to happen, but like I said, I think the UK has a lot of other priorities, so I'm not really sure how soon that may actually happen, if that happens at all.
Okay. Fair enough. I don't know how it works in the UK. Does it change if it's a Conservative government to a Labour government? Do we have any sentiment of what one would do different to the other? Maybe that's a
Yeah,
question.
not in terms of what we've been discussing today, let's just say.
Fine.
Not that
Fine.
I'm
Let's
aware
leave it
of.
there. I'll
Yeah.
let others go into the detail of that. And again, this is about Europe as well as the UK. Okay, there are no questions from the audience, which I can't believe, but let's, for you and I, take that as positive reinforcement that we've asked and answered a lot of what's needed to be discussed. In which case, I'll try and summarize quickly, and maybe you can just add anything else on top if you feel there's a need. But there's a new commission. They're about to give us their new scope of work, let's call it. So there's a few crumbs of enthusiasm that they want to add a little bit of intensity, we think, across a couple of areas, which might be important. And the three big things that we discussed today: front of pack nutritional labeling and nutrient profiles, for example. And then there's maximum permitted levels. And there is the nutritional health claims, were the three big areas at this stage that we've got some movements on, but there's a little bit of status quo that sits within the middle of it. Is that right?
That's exactly right. I think we know what's happened in the past. We have some idea of what could potentially be coming in the next 5 years, but no major changes at this point, let's just say. Yeah.
Great. Right. Super. That pretty much takes us to the end of our time. Thanks very much, Claudia, for joining us, and of course, ESSNA and the White House Communications for putting this webinar on. Generally, I think it remains really interesting, although we are similarly talking about a lot of things we've been talking about for quite some time. Now, there was two big areas that we didn't discuss today, if anyone hadn't noticed. Sustainability, to which I know is a big important area for ESSNA, and also the interests and potential disruption that AI causes us in so many different areas. They were so big that we decided that they needed to be two other webinars like this in 2025. So this one was about like the core areas, and we will do two more in 2025, dates TPC or TBC. So look out for those, where we will tackle sustainability independently, and we'll look at AI and maybe some other online stuff independently. Okay, so they will come, and if you enjoyed this, then no doubt you will enjoy those two when they come through. So look out for them. Otherwise, final point is to say thank you for joining live, if you did, watching on demand. Any questions, please funnel those through to ESSNA. If you're not a member, you should be. Join the fight, be part of the voice. And otherwise, have a happy rest of November, and let's start getting excited about December and Christmas. So thank you very much to everyone listening, and see you all soon. Claudia.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Thanks, Nick.